meaning of refuge and generating bodhicitta and then recite the Sangyicharang prayer. So think how all sentient beings are the same as oneself in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. Despite the fact of wanting happiness and not wanting suffering because of being confused about what we need to do in order to find that happiness and avoid that suffering, free ourselves of that suffering. We continually create the causes for more suffering, and almost is as if we're running away from happiness and running towards suffering all the time because of not creating the cause for happiness and creating only the cause of suffering. Therefore, despite wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, most of the mother sentient beings, our old mother sentient beings, right now are experiencing the suffering of the lower realms, while the rest of us, because of having created the karma, created exactly the same karma that caused them, the rest of the sentient beings who are in the lower realms, to be born there. So they're there, most sentient beings in the lower realms, and that very same karma is something that we have in our minds, the imprints we have. So at any moment our lives can come to an end. And we also will have to join them. So in this way, think about the suffering of the lower realms, of oneself and others. And then think how unbearable that is. Which means thinking, I have to do something about this. I myself alone definitely am going to do something about this. No matter how hard it is, and no matter how long it takes. I'm going to do something. I have to. I'm going to. And even when one is from time to time free from being in one of the lower realms, so that one is born as a human being or as a god, demigod. It doesn't last. It doesn't last long at all. Especially as human beings, we can see at any moment it could be over. So it is for all sentient beings that wherever one is born in psychic existence, there's either this visible suffering, or we're just about to be born somewhere where there is that obvious kind of suffering. Because of being under control of the karma and the mental afflictions. So think of that for a few moments in order to find that totally unbearable. The people around us in this room, the people around us in this this county and this state, this country, this world, human beings for the moment, walking around without any kind of awareness, but in fact at any moment this life can come to an end, and then so much suffering. So in this way try to find that unbearable, again thinking, I've got to do something about this, I'm going to do something about this. I myself alone, I'm going to do something. I'm going to put an end to this. I'm going to liberate them all. Now to be able to do that, we need help. And nobody can really help like the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. The Buddha is a person who has the power and the wisdom and the compassion to help us. The main way they help is through their teaching, the Dharma. And then the Sangha, the spiritual community, those people who, by their example of how they practice, show us how to put the Buddha's teachings into practice. So generate a strong feeling of faith in those three. Faith that they have the ability to help us. Actually going for refuge is entrusting oneself to the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. The difference between entrusting oneself and having faith is like you have a heavy bag and there's a hook on the wall, and you look at that hook and you think, if I put this bag on that hook, it's going to be able to hold it up. So that's like having the faith. The bag is like the suffering. And then actually putting that bag on that hook would be like entrusting oneself to that hook. So entrusting oneself to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So that you actually start practicing the Buddha's teachings. You entrust yourself, and that implies you're going to actually and do everything you can to take the Buddha's teachings, listen to the Buddha's teachings, try to understand them, and then put them into practice. And then generating bodhicitta. So with the help of the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, what I'm principally going to try to achieve is complete awakening so that I can benefit others mainly by teaching and leading them along the path. So generating bodhicitta and then practicing the 6 perfections and the 4 means of gathering. Sangye Jedan Zoye Janam Lai Janju Batu Tani Kyasu Je Dagi Jinzo Yebe Zonangi Rola Penje Sangye Druba Jo Sangye Jedan Zoye Janam Lai Janju Batu Tani Kyasu Je Dagi Jinzo Yebe Zonangi Rola Penje Sangye Drupa Jo Sangye Jeran Zoye Janam La Janju Badu Dani Gyapsu Je Dagi Jinzo Yebe Zonangi Rola Penje Sangye Drupa Jo. And in order to be able to achieve enlightenment of the sake of all sentient beings, particularly I'm going to spend this time up until about 6 reflecting on the Buddha's teachings, particularly the teachings from last night, and so reflecting on their meaning and then trying to think of how we're going to make use of that teaching in order to be able to transform, make some kind of change, turn things around into a more constructive direction or way of being. So now, one of the things that Rinpoche spent some time on last night was the suffering of change. So, suffering of change is contaminated happiness. It means the happiness, or pleasant feelings, pleasant sensations that beings who are not yet beyond psychic existence experience. So it's pretty straightforward. The pleasure you get from eating food, wearing nice clothes, maybe any kind of pleasure or happiness we experience. That's also something to think about, whether it actually means every experience that we have that we would call a nice, a good feeling, nice feeling. Usually they focus on the kind of pleasant sensation you get from eating and drinking and, of course, sex, all those kind of things. So now, what we can do, we can look at one statement Rinpoche made. The suffering of change doesn't increase and it doesn't last. Okay. That's one thing. We can spend one short meditation session thinking about that. So, this means that Rinpoche stated a pervasion. Remember we were talking about this some days ago. A pervasion is like anything which is samsaric pleasure, you could say, worldly pleasure, the suffering of change. It doesn't increase. So pervasion or rule, you could state it, if it's the suffering of change, it doesn't increase. So now we can do our own inner debate, which is a way of trying to get at the meaning of the teachings. So you need to test this, because it's something that's very easy to test. That's what makes the... I know you hear this a lot of the time, but anyway, sincerely, I think it's what makes it scientific. This teaching is scientific because you've got something you can work with, you can test. So now, how to test it is by trying to find something that you would call the suffering of change, so the kind of pleasure that we experience, which does increase. Maybe you can think of some that don't increase, but anyway, that's not going to help so much here. We want to prove that this is wrong. And the more you try to prove this wrong and you can't, then the more you really know from your own experience and from your own insights that it's true. You're not just accepting it because somebody said. So try to think of samsaric pleasure, something which is a suffering of change, which does increase. That obviously means increases over a period of time. See if you can think of something. to argue against that. You've come up with something, assume you've come up with something that you think is the suffering of change, but does increase. Now try to ask the question, well, does it really? Try to argue against it in your own mind. So here's one. Like in relationships. So first of all, you see this person as quite attractive. So there's one feeling of kind of pleasure from looking. And then maybe there's a smile. I don't know what it's like when you get like older, but when you're younger and you're just starting out, that's really quite something. So a little bit more pleasure. And then maybe there's this the date, asking for a date or being asked, and being accepted. Wow, then there's even more pleasure. And then holding hands later, and so on and so on. So it might be that in the end, everything goes bad, like Rinpoche said. Whether it always does or doesn't, that's another thing to think about. But doesn't that mean that for a while it was increasing? So to try to find out the answer to that for yourself. Isn't that a case where the pleasure got more and more? Just spend a couple of minutes thinking about that. So maybe this isn't a good example because there are different types of pleasure. The question really would be, you might get some pleasure from looking, but if you keep looking, does the pleasure increase? You might get some pleasure from a smile, but if the person just keeps smiling, does the pleasure keep, does it build up? Just get greater and greater and greater pleasure. Holding hands, if you just keep holding hands, does the pleasure increase? Keep building up and up and up, more and more and more intense, stronger and stronger and stronger. Does that happen? That would be the question. So now, as for everything which is suffering of change doesn't last, well, that's pretty obvious. Whatever kind of pleasure you have, it does come to an end eventually. If nothing else brings it to an end, then death will bring it to an end. Right, the happiest marriage is going to ends in death. So what's the conclusion? every suffering of change, every samsaric or worldly pleasure, contaminated pleasure, has the defect of not increasing and not lasting. So, what's the conclusion? I think it depends very much on. I mean, just thinking about that might make you think, well, so that's what the pleasure that's available to me at the moment is like. So is there something better? If there isn't, then you just better, make do with what you got. But here the conclusion is that on the one hand, you've got the pure happiness of liberation and enlightenment. On the other hand, you've got this kind of worldly pleasure. So, which is it to be? Which one are you going to choose? In other words, what's the point in putting so much energy into that worldly pleasure, when if you were to put your energy into this, the real happiness of liberation and enlightenment, you would get something that lasts. You would get something that really gives satisfaction. It's a bit like that Eddie Izzard skit or whatever, cake or death. And maybe you haven't seen it. Cake or death, which do you want to choose? I think I'll go for the cake, thank you. So, which would you rather have? This kind of happiness, which is, it always comes to an end and it always ends up in suffering? Or do you want this real happiness? I think I'll go for the real one, thank you. So this is a conclusion anyway. Maybe there's other conclusions, but this is all to do with seeing the defects of psychic existence and then sort of losing interest in it, just giving up on it. Because either you've got the suffering of suffering, or when that's not happening, you've got the suffering of change, which is just not real happiness. And that's another meditation about whether what we call suffering of change. There's a teaching that says that actually it's just suffering. When one suffering gets less, then we think that that's happiness. It's not because happiness itself has happened, just because the suffering got a bit less, so then we think that's happiness. And when those two are not happening, then there's still the pervasive compounding suffering, which means basically you still have these contaminated aggregates, this body and mind, which are a product of one's previous karma and the mental afflictions, the klesha, with which we create the possibilities of more suffering and more of these mental afflictions in the future, so which are therefore dissatisfactory or in the nature of suffering. So that even when we're not experiencing the suffering and the suffering of change, even when there's a kind of neutral sensation, at any moment that could come to an end, and one of the other kinds of suffering can happen. And we can never be free of that until we're free of the karma and the afflictive thoughts and emotions, and especially the root of all that, which is ignorance, then real happiness is possible. And just like that's possible for each one of us, that's possible for all sentient beings. So the sentient beings right now are experiencing such awful happiness, suffering, but this kind of happiness is possible for them. Liberation is possible for them, like it's possible for me. Enlightenment is possible for them, like it's possible for me. So the plan to achieve enlightenment in order to lead them to liberation and enlightenment is a realistic one. It's something that can be achieved. Okay, we'll have a short break.